Have you ever wondered if it is possible to save a democracy by committing a murder? Welcome to another deep dive. Today we are talking about the dark, thrilling, and tragic final days of the Roman Republic. In our previous chapters, we watched this grand civilization fracture under the weight of its own internal greed, systemic corruption, and unchecked military ambition. We saw a brilliant, utterly ruthless general named Julius Caesar stand at the muddy edge of the Rubicon River, knowing with absolute certainty that to cross that forbidden boundary meant triggering a catastrophic civil war across the Mediterranean world. He crossed it anyway, uttering the legendary words that the die was cast. But what actually happens when the die finally lands on the table of history? What happens when the long, bloody war is ultimately won? The powerful rivals are all dead, and one single man holds the entire civilized world in the palm of his hand. This is the expansive story of how Julius Caesar transformed himself into an absolute master, how he won the hearts of the desperate poor while driving the aristocratic elite to madness, and how a secretive group of politicians enacted the most famous assassination in human history, only to realize far too late that they had permanently destroyed the very thing they were trying so desperately to save. To truly understand how Caesar managed to completely corner his political opponents, we have to look closer at the sheer mechanical genius of his military campaigns following that fateful river crossing. Caesar did not just fight battles. He played a high-stakes psychological game with the entire Roman world. He marched through Italy with such blistering speed that his opponents panicked, abandoning the capital before they even knew the size of his army. This wasn't standard warfare. It was a blitzkrieg of antiquity. The Senate had expected a slow, methodical civil war where they could gather their immense resources from across the provinces. Instead, Caesar's legendary Celeritas, his signature terrifying speed, caught them completely unprepared. He didn't wait for his full army to cross the river. He pushed forward with just a single legion, living off the land, capturing key towns by sheer surprise, and presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a defender of the common people's rights. This terrifying momentum broke the psychological resolve of the traditional elite before a major battle was even fought. His chief rival, Pompey the Great, once universally regarded as Rome's greatest and most invincible military mind, was utterly blindsided and overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying speed of Caesar's tactical advance. Driven completely out of the Italian peninsula, pursued relentlessly across the vast waters of the Mediterranean Sea, Pompey eventually staked his entire legacy and the future of the Republic on a massive, bloody clash in Greece. At the Battle of Pharsalus, despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1, Caesar's tactical brilliance outmaneuvered Pompey's forces, turning the highly anticipated showdown into a total rout, and watching his legions get utterly crushed by Caesar's battle-hardened, fiercely loyal troops. Terrified, broken, and desperate for survival, Pompey fled directly to the desert shores of Egypt, hoping against hope to find sanctuary among old allies. Instead, the young Egyptian king, Ptolemy XIII, eager to win the immediate favor of the approaching victor, ordered Pompey to be executed the very moment his feet stepped off his small boat onto the sand. When Julius Caesar finally arrived in Egypt shortly after and was solemnly presented with the severed head of his great rival, he did not cheer or celebrate. He wept openly for his fallen countrymen, recognizing the tragedy of Rome's greatest minds destroying each other. But the stark message sent to the rest of the known world was completely undeniable. There was absolutely no one left alive who possessed the power to stand against him. When Caesar finally marched back into the ancient city of Rome, the atmosphere in the crowded streets was thick with a heavy, suffocating mixture of profound awe and absolute, paralyzing terror. He did not return as a humble general submissively submitting himself to the legal authority of the civilian government. He returned as the undisputed, total master of the entire civilized world. The public squares erupted in massive celebrations and grand triumphs, celebrating his victories across Gaul, Egypt, Pharnaces, and Africa. Gold flowed through the streets, and thousands of prisoners marched in chains. But inside the cold stone walls of the Senate House, the traditional politicians were suffocating on their own immense fear and bitter resentment. They knew with absolute certainty that the old rules of the Republic were gone forever. To permanently cement his absolute control over the state, Caesar forced the terrified Senate to grant him a legal title that completely shattered 5 centuries of sacred Roman tradition. He was officially named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. This wasn't just a regular political appointment, it was the formal execution of the Republic. To truly understand the deep psychological horror and profound cultural shock this caused, you have to understand exactly what Rome was to its core. For 500 long years, the foundational bedrock of Roman identity was a fierce, almost religious, uncompromising hatred of monarchy. They had driven out their last tyrannical king, Tarquin the Proud, centuries ago, swearing a sacred blood oath that anyone who ever attempted to become a king in Rome again would be executed immediately without a trial. The very word for king, rex, was treated like a toxic curse word in polite political society. Now, a single, all-powerful man sat elevated above the law, holding permanent, absolute authority over their lives. The Republic was not just wounded, it was being actively, completely hollowed out from the inside. Yet if you stepped outside the elite Senate House and walked among the ordinary, bustling people of Rome, the perspective shifted entirely. To the millions of working-class citizens, impoverished slaves, and struggling military veterans, Julius Caesar was not a terrifying tyrant at all. He was a God-sent hero, a protector, and a savior. For generations, the incredibly wealthy elite in the Senate had completely ignored the systemic suffering of the masses, hoarding vast amounts of land, manipulating the markets, and letting the poor freeze and starve in the crowded wooden apartment blocks of the Suburra slums. Caesar changed all of that almost overnight. He launched a series of sweeping, incredibly visionary reforms designed specifically to lift the heavy, crushing burdens from the backs of the common people. He canceled a massive, unprecedented portion of the deep debts that kept the ordinary citizens in a state of perpetual poverty and financial slavery. He boldly seized vast territories of public and private land from corrupt elites and redistributed them directly to tens of thousands of retired military veterans who had given their youth and blood for Rome's glory, ensuring they wouldn't end up homeless on the streets. He even took on the very fabric of time itself, reforming the deeply corrupt, politically manipulated Roman calendar into the highly accurate, solar-based Julian calendar, an incredible system so brilliant that we still basically use its core foundation to this very day. Nowhere was Caesar's deep devotion to the common people clearer or more impactful than in his radical restructuring of the historic grain dole. For years, the greedy aristocrats of the Senate had used the distribution of free grain as a cynical political weapon, intentionally cutting off food supplies or manipulating grain prices to keep the public compliant, desperate, and hungry. Caesar stepped in with total authority and seized absolute control of the entire system. He stabilized the food supply lines, thoroughly cleaned out the deep-seated corruption, and personally ensured that the poorest families of Rome would never have to face the threat of starvation because of political games played by the wealthy. He even financed massive public works projects out of his own pocket, creating thousands of jobs for unemployed citizens and transforming Rome from a city of decaying brick into a capital worthy of an empire. To the average citizen walking the streets, the high-minded arguments of the Senate regarding liberty and tradition sounded completely hollow, selfish, and hypocritical. Why should they care about preserving a democracy that only served to keep the rich wealthy and the poor powerless? To them, Caesar was the only true leader who actually cared about their survival, boldly executing the exact visionary, necessary reforms that Rome had desperately needed for over 100 years. But as the months rolled on, a dark, unsettling shadow began to fall over Caesar's brilliant, effective rule. The tone within the city of Rome shifted sharply from benevolent, protective leadership to overwhelming, blinding ego. Caesar's immense, unchecked power began to swallow his personality whole. He no longer behaved like a humble citizen among fellow citizens. He began to carry himself with the pomp and arrogance of an Eastern emperor. He ordered a magnificent golden throne to be placed permanently for him inside the Senate House, looking down physically and metaphorically upon the politicians as he conducted the business of the state. He allowed temples to be built to his clemency, and whisperings began to spread that he wished to be worshipped as a living god. Even more shocking and deeply offensive to the proud Roman sensibility, he began minting gold and silver coins featuring his own living face. In the ancient Mediterranean world, putting your own living image on currency was a divine right reserved exclusively for arrogant, self-proclaimed foreign god kings. To the proud, traditional senators of Rome, this was an unforgivable, agonizing insult to their dignity. They watched in horror as the man who originally claimed to be a humble savior of the people slowly adopted all the gaudy trappings and supreme arrogance of royalty, ignoring the senator's presence entirely when they came to present him with new honors. The bubbling tension finally reached a dangerous boiling point during the wild, chaotic public festival of the Lupercalia. As Caesar sat elevated high above the roaring crowds on his golden chair, dressed in his triumphal purple robes, his loyal right-hand man and top general, Mark Antony, stepped forward holding a royal crown, a golden diadem, the ultimate, unmistakable symbol of absolute kingship. In full, clear view of the gathered public, Antony attempted to place the royal crown directly onto Caesar's head. The massive crowd did not cheer. Instead, a heavy, incredibly tense, suffocating silence fell over the public square, quickly followed by scattered, angry booing from the citizens. Seeing the negative reaction of the people, Caesar quickly waved the crown away with a dismissive gesture. Antony, undeterred, tried a second time, and then a third time, and each time Caesar rejected the crown, eventually ordering it to be carried away to the high temple of Jupiter, loudly proclaiming to the crowd that Jupiter alone was the true king of Rome. The crowd erupted in wild applause at his rejection of the crown, but to the watching, terrified senators, the entire event felt like a deeply calculated, rehearsed test. They believed with absolute certainty that Caesar was intentionally gauging the public's willingness to accept a literal king. Even though he had refused the crown that day, the underlying message to his enemies was loud and clear. Caesar wanted total, uncompromised submission. The traditionalists realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that their democracy was completely dead. Laws no longer held any real weight. Ancient traditions were entirely meaningless, and the only thing that mattered in the entire world was the unpredictable whim of Julius Caesar. This paralyzing fear quickly mutated into a desperate, highly secret, and deadly conspiracy. A dedicated group of over 60 senators, men who had watched the steady, agonizing death of their beloved republic with growing fury and helplessness, formed a solemn, secret pact of blood. They met in the shadows of private estates, speaking in hushed tones, fully aware that a single leak would mean their immediate execution. This dangerous alliance was led by the sharp, calculating, and resentful Gaius Cassius, alongside a man whose surprising involvement changed the entire dynamic of the plot, Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was not just another random politician in the Senate. He was a deeply respected, highly philosophical traditionalist, a direct descendant of the legendary hero who had overthrew Rome's last tyrannical king centuries before, and a close, beloved personal friend to Caesar himself. The conspirators knew they needed Brutus. His untarnished reputation gave their dark plot a veneer of moral legitimacy. They forged letters from anonymous citizens and left them on Brutus's praetor's chair, begging him to wake up and live up to his ancestors' name. These men did not view themselves as common murderers, backstabbing criminals, or treasonous plotters. In their own minds, they were the liberators. They genuinely, passionately believed that they were performing a sacred, heroic, and noble duty to save the Republic from a monster. They believed with total conviction that if they could just eliminate the one powerful man holding the crown, the ancient democracy would instantly snap back into its proper place, and freedom would be restored to the people. The conspirators chose their moment with terrifying, flawless precision. March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March. As the fateful morning finally arrived, the universe itself seemed to scream terrifying warnings directly at Julius Caesar. The ancient historical accounts tell of a strange, eerie, and supernatural atmosphere gripping the entire city of Rome. Lights flashed across the sky, and animals offered for sacrifice were found to have no hearts. A famous, blind seer had approached Caesar in the crowded streets days prior, delivering a haunting, cryptic warning to beware the Ides of March. On the very night before the scheduled Senate meeting, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, woke up screaming in total terror from a horrific, vivid nightmare where she held her husband's broken, blood-soaked body in her arms. She begged him, on her knees with tears streaming down her face, not to leave the house or attend the Senate that day. For a brief moment, Caesar actually hesitated, feeling the weight of the omens. But his supreme confidence, his absolute, blinding belief in his own destiny and invincibility, ultimately blinded him to the danger. Decimus, one of the conspirators who masqueraded as his loyal ally, arrived at Caesar's home and mocked the warnings, telling Caesar that the Senate would think he was weak if he stayed home over his wife's dreams. That bit of psychological manipulation worked. Brushing aside the dark omens, ignoring the frantic pleas of his terrified wife, and openly laughing off the warning of the blind seer as he passed him in the street once again, telling him that the Ides of March had come, to which the seer replied that they had come but not yet gone, Caesar walked proudly toward his hidden fate. He entered the grand theater of Pompey, where the Senate was temporarily meeting, completely unarmed, unaccompanied by his usual bodyguards, trusting entirely in his status as an untouchable titan of history. The exact moment Caesar sat down upon his golden throne, the traitors tightly closed the trap. They surrounded him closely under the false pretense of presenting a legal political petition, pressing in tight so he could not move, escape, or draw his iron writing stylus. They pretended to plead for the return of an exiled citizen, pulling Caesar's focus away from his surroundings. Suddenly, one of the conspirators, Tullius Cimber, aggressively grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it down forcefully from his neck. This was the final, fatal signal. Out of the deep folds of their flowing robes, dozens of senators simultaneously drew sharpened daggers. The first knife struck wildly, as Casca drove his blade into Caesar's shoulder, slashing across Caesar's neck. The dictator reeled in total shock, crying out in pain, and began to fight back with immense, desperate ferocity, using his sharp iron stylus to ward off the rain of blows. He scrambled across the marble floor, bleeding heavily, defending his life against the overwhelming, chaotic onslaught of his own colleagues. The hall erupted into a screaming frenzy as uninitiated senators fled toward the doors, trampling one another to escape the unfolding nightmare. But then, the absolute chaos suddenly froze in time. Through the crowd of frantic attackers, Caesar looked up and saw Marcus Junius Brutus standing directly over him, a raised blade gleaming brightly in his hand. The sight of the man he loved like a son, the man he had protected, advanced, and cherished, completely broke Caesar's spirit. Whispering his final, legendary words of heartbreaking betrayal, Caesar stopped fighting entirely. He reached up with trembling hands, pulled his purple toga completely over his face to hide his dying expressions from his killers, and accepted his tragic fate. The conspirators descended upon him in a wild, bloodthirsty frenzy, stabbing his body 23 times, until Julius Caesar finally collapsed and bled out at the base of a massive statue of his old, dead rival, Pompey the Great. The liberators stood triumphantly over the mangled, breathless corpse, panting heavily, covered from head to toe in dark blood, and raised their red daggers high into the air, shouting to the heavens that Rome was finally free. They fully believed that by killing the tyrant, they had successfully saved democracy. They ran out into the streets, waving a cap on a spear to symbolize liberation, fully expecting the citizens of Rome to burst into spontaneous applause and celebrate the return of the ancient laws. But they had profoundly miscalculated the mood of the city. The ordinary people didn't cheer. Instead, a terrifying, dead silence gripped the city as shopkeepers slammed their shutters closed and citizens locked themselves inside their homes, gripped by panic. The real tragedy was about to begin. The conspirators had no plan for what would happen the day after the assassination. They simply assumed the government would run itself. But by removing the central pillar of authority, they had removed the only thing preventing total collapse. Mark Antony quickly seized Caesar's money and papers, utilizing his funeral to deliver an explosive speech that turned the volatile crowds into a raging mob, hunting the conspirators through the streets and forcing them to flee the capital for their lives. The senators thought that removing Caesar would automatically restore the old, beautiful republic, but they completely failed to realize that the republic was already dead, and Caesar was the only thing keeping the ruins stable. By striking him down, they did not bring back freedom. Instead, they unleashed a cataclysmic, world-consuming wave of chaos, fresh civil wars, and a terrifying power vacuum that would consume millions of innocent lives. The assassination did not save the Republic. It tore it apart forever, clearing the dark, bloody path for something far more absolute, far more ruthless, and far more permanent than Caesar could have ever imagined. They killed a dictator to save a democracy, but all they did was set the stage for an emperor. Next time, the final collapse begins. This was part 3 of our comprehensive journey through the rise and fall of the Roman world. If you want to make sure you are right there with us when the ultimate chaos unfolds, do not forget to hit that subscribe button right now so you do not miss out when part 4 drops and the final empire rises from the ashes.